Income inequality. How bad is it? Is it getting worse? Or are we being misled? Hi everyone, my name is Joe Bob, and this is Barely Paying Attention. Today we're going to be addressing one of the bigger political talking points that might be getting a little more attention than it deserves: income inequality. Over the last several years, income inequality has been a hot topic for many politicians and political talking heads. The widening gap between the top and the bottom of the socioeconomic classes is seen to be among capitalism's biggest flaws. Bigger than the flaw in judgment of a certain captain on a certain ship in a certain canal. Since 1967, income inequality has seen a 20% increase. Now, if we were to just leave it there, that would be a big problem. But it's not that simple. We want to outline some of the pretty important factors that are missing when we talk about statistics surrounding income inequality. In order to do that, we need to ask, what is income? Which is a question my freeloader cousin Craig hasn't been able to answer since he needed a place to crash for a week almost 4 years ago. So how do we or should we define income? For most people, they don't define their own personal revenue as income. Instead, they define their take-home profit as income. What I mean is that most people look at their income as their take-home purchasing power. Any money that you don't get to keep doesn't factor into your buying decisions. Say you make $2,000 on a paycheck. You don't get to keep all $2,000. After federal income tax, state income tax, Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare, you might only get to deposit $1,600. To you and me, that $1,600 is what we'll base our purchasing decisions on, and that is your actual income. One of the problems with this is the disconnect between how we all define income and how the government defines income. The government defines income as what you make before you're taxed. It's kind of like taking a picture of a beautiful charcuterie board before Aunt Marge gets all into the grapes and such. Now, while there really isn't any other good way to figure out what people should be taxed, at this point it seems like we're talking about two different things: taxable income and take-home income. And like we pointed out earlier, the reason those two things are necessarily different is based on view of purchasing power. Similar to the example in our last video about taxable profit, if you have a $50,000 a year salary but have $12,000 taken out by taxes, your true take-home income is $38,000, not $50,000. Your salary is what you tell your girlfriend. Your take-home income is what you tell your wife once you're married. Here's why this is important. When politicians and political talking heads kick and scream about how bad income inequality has gotten, they're citing data from the United States Census Bureau. The Census Bureau is where we get stats that say income inequality has widened by over 20% in the last 50 years. But there's a catch. The Census Bureau doesn't count taxes paid as lost income. Basically, when the Census Bureau is calculating differences in income, they don't factor in a greater tax burden that comes with a higher salary. And with a progressive tax system, a greater tax burden is something that just has to be accounted for. Let's say Jamal makes $100,000 a year in San Francisco. After federal, state, local, FICA taxes, that'll get him to around $70,000 in take-home income. On the other side of the country, Chris makes $40,000 a year in Tampa. After taxes, his take-home income will be around $34,000. This is where the reported income inequality gap starts to have some problems. The Census Bureau would see that as a $60,000 income gap, but in reality, after taxes, it's more like a $36,000 take-home income gap, which is almost half the difference of what the government reports. And we're not even factoring in cost of living, utility taxes, transportation fees, etc. Essentially, if the Census Bureau were to factor in taxes as lost income, then the narrative around income inequality would look a lot different, especially as the gap begins to close. But interestingly enough, in like almost everything we've talked about on this show, doesn't stop there. The Census Bureau also doesn't include about 2/3 of government transfers as income, meaning that the majority of the money that the federal government pays out in the form of government aid or government-funded services also isn't included in the income of the recipients. programs like Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and about 100 other government transfer programs. These are expenses that non-qualifying individuals would have to pay for out of pocket, and they aren't included in the income of the individuals receiving those benefits. Earned income tax credits are received by beneficiaries in the form of checks from the U.S. Treasury. Food stamps allow beneficiaries to buy food on government-issued debit cards, and a bunch of other ways that the government distributes money directly to those who qualify. But none of that money is included when the Census Bureau measures income inequality. If somebody gives me $1,000, that won't increase my income according to the government, but it will factor into my purchasing decisions. Therefore, to me, that's income. If the Census Bureau were to take income tax loss into account for top earners and include government money transfers into income for lower earners, the increase in the income inequality gap over the last 50 years goes from 21.4% to just 2.3%, which is almost a 90% difference. And being off by 90% on anything is pretty bad, especially if you're skydiving. Oh my God! But get this, in the last 50 years, the Census Bureau has changed the way it's collected and stored income data. Twice. That means that the increase in income inequality gap that we see has different parameters than the 1960s and 1970s. Without getting into the specifics of what changed and why, we know that in order to see consistent and meaningful stats, the data needs to be adjusted to account for those two Census Bureau changes. Lucky for us, Phil Gramm, a former chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, and John Early, who served twice as the Assistant Commissioner to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, made those adjustments for us. When accounting for the reporting changes made by the Census Bureau, Gramm and Early found the increase in the income inequality gap wasn't an increase at all. In reality, when adjusted for the tax burden income loss, government transfer income gains, Census Bureau recording discrepancies, and inflation, over the last 50 years, the income inequality gap is shrinking. The discussion around income inequality should be based on real-world purchasing power, not some pre-tax, pre-benefit dollar figure. And the reporting on income inequality needs to reflect what's actually going on. Next time you hear phrases like, income inequality is the worst it's ever been, or hear calls to increase taxes to help close the gap, know that the supposedly widening income inequality gap is actually going the other direction. And recognizing that can help us move on to more pressing and more important issues that need to be addressed. That's our show. For those of you barely paying attention, thanks for doing so. We will see you next time.